Hi, everybody. I'm Dustin. Thank you for coming. I teach in the English and Philosophy department at Missouri Southern. Thank you to Peace Lutheran for allowing us to meet in this beautiful space. Welcome to Frankenstein Week overall. Thank you for coming. Thank you especially to Dr. Amy Gates, whose vision, along with the dedicated work of a lot of people in the English and Philosophy department, have helped to make Frankenstein Week possible, and we're hoping to do themed weeks for the next 20 years or something like that. It won't be next year Robinson Crusoe, maybe. So some excitement to follow. But speaking of Frankenstein Week, you can attend Frankenstein events all week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week. All those events are held at Missouri Southern. Most of them start at 7. Please feel invited to reference a schedule. I think there are a whole lot of them. I have 5. So feel invited to reference a schedule and attend as often as you like. Today we will be hearing from Reverend Richard Gates on theology and Frankenstein. I'm especially excited to hear this talk because the last time I read Frankenstein, I was a graduate student, and we met to discuss the novel, and I was referencing all of these. I was like, I think there's a lot of engagement here with the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, this line, and my professor is like, she was very nice about it, and she seemed interested, and she was like, I don't really know anything about that. So, it's not her fault. You can't know everything, right? So it's no big deal. But I do still have a lot of questions about theology and Frankenstein, which I'm hoping to get answered today. So thank you, Rich. Reverend Gates holds a master's degree in divinity from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago and frequently preaches here at Peace Lutheran. I also know Rich to be an above-average trivia player, an incredibly generous host, a technologically inclined person, as you just saw, saving the lectern here, and an overall good guy. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Rich Gates.
There we go. There is a sign on the exterior wall of the Walker Art Institute in Minneapolis that reads, "Bits and pieces put together to form a semblance of a whole." So within the substance and subject of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I'm convinced that is an apt description for any group that willingly gathers together to take up the topic of theology in Frankenstein. As members of the Missouri Southern academic community, the faith community of Joplin, and the wider community of the 4 states region, each of you bringing both unique and shared understandings of Frankenstein and his creature, of the roles of literature, of the various faith traditions that are in relationship to our communities, of love and hate, evil and goodness, horror and blessing, doubt and certainty. We together, at least through this next hour or so, certainly embody bits and pieces put together to form a semblance of a whole. And so with that in mind, I want to thank each of you all for being here this afternoon. Welcome. I'm told the temperature should be getting a little more moderate here soon. I hope that each of you will find the bits and pieces that I share will contribute to your wider experience of the whole of Frankenstein Week here at Missouri Southern and in this community. And as we enter together into discussion of theology and Frankenstein, it may help to take just a step back or two and look briefly at the bits and pieces in this topic. First, there is the bit we call Frankenstein, right? It's a bit, though, that is composed of many pieces in its own. Beginning with a ghost story challenge in 1816, Frankenstein has had both an enduring and multifaceted existence. I have a question for you at this point. What have been your experiences of the Frankenstein story? And this is so live interaction.
This morning, my partner said, I was talking about what I was doing today, he said, Frankenstein was written by a woman?
Ah, okay, yes, yes.
As a girl, I thought, of course, Frankenstein had been written by a man.
No, yeah, true. Other experiences. There's the guy out front, the character you may have noticed coming in. That's a little bit of an experience of Frankenstein. Others?
We took it apart in English class and read it, and then, which is now, a great book, obviously. And then in high school anatomy class, as we dissected the cat, we watched Young Frankenstein.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's the movie connections. Yeah, the movie connections. Other movies that anyone has seen? The original, that's the James Well, I think, is that right? Version? Yeah. Others? Yeah, Boris Karloff, Bride of Frankenstein. Any others people have been watching? Young Frankenstein. Okay. There's the 1818 novel, the 1831 novel, films, plays, musicals, Halloween costumes, haunted houses. Anybody had Frankenstein at a haunted house? Yeah. Herman on the Munsters. Yeah. Don't forget him. Some of these are closer in their theological connection at their surface, and some are quite distant. The movie Bride of Frankenstein, for example, has been described as the most theological of movies by a few, bar none. In this movie, the creature takes on a very Christ-like image as one who, in the words of Isaiah, is despised and rejected, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. He even joins the blind hermit in that movie in a form of Eucharistic sharing of bread and wine. The guy out front, though, on the other hand, is a comically unthreatening figure, seemingly as removed from theological debates as could be, and yet the image of this creature still conveys a story having theological import. The image of something created and made alive, not by God, but by human hands. The image of one who is human and not human. The image of being one with unique strength, and yet, in his isolation, incomparably vulnerable. And perhaps that is a portion of why Mary Shelley's story has endured over the past 200 years. Her story of creator and creature, of love and fear, of illness and healing, of relationship and loneliness, of good and evil, of life and death, is a story that parallels questions of faith, questions that have haunted humanity since before history began. The questions that are indeed at the heart of theology. Which brings me to the next set of bits and pieces that are necessary to our discussion today, the bits and pieces that we call theology. What would you name as theology? What does it mean to describe a conversation as being theological? Any thoughts on that? Invoking Christ, all right. Others?
Foundational questions.
Foundational questions, good, yeah, excellent. Other thoughts?
My thought is, I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, it's a mystery, yeah. You might be thinking in the back of your mind that theology means it's Bible-based, or that it involves doctrine, right? Says something about ministry, that it describes the church or other religious institutions, that it says something about ethics in society. Some may recognize that it's been, at least at one point, was known as the queen of the sciences. In the medieval ages, everything had to be in relationship to God and God's word, and so all the other sciences did that by connecting through something called theology. You might think of it as being the stuff done by, well, names like Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Soren Kierkegaard, Reinhold Niebuhr, and other white, mostly German, dead men. Or you might think of the feminist perspective, or liberation theology, or African American theology, or womanist theologies, the celebration of life in the midst of suffering and walking in love in the midst of hate. Or maybe you might think of it in terms of song lyrics. As we consider Frankenstein today, Eminem's fairly recent song, Walk on Water, may come to mind. Frankenstein, of course, taking largely on place on frozen water, right? I walk on water, but I ain't no Jesus. As the lyrics go, I walk on water, but only when it freezes. Because I'm only human, just like you. I've been making mistakes. Oh, if you only knew, I don't think you should believe in me the way that you do. Because I'm terrified to let you down. Oh, if I walked on water, I would drown. Because I'm just a man. But as long as I got a mic, I'm godlike. There's theology in there. One of my seminary professors described theology like this. God first addresses us, addresses humanity in the person of Adam in Genesis, using this question, where are you? Where are you? Theology, according to that professor, is our response to that question. Or to put it another way, an underlying characteristic of the theology is that faith and inquiry, faith and question are inseparable. Theology itself arises from the freedom and responsibility of a community to inquire about its beliefs and its convictions. In this way, theology is not mere repetition or traditional doctrine, nor academic exercise in philosophical thinking. It's not a careful balancing of myth and logic to be enforced by law. Rather, theology is the persistent search for a truth which these things can only partially and brokenly express. Understood as a continuing inquiry, the spirit of theology is interrogative. It presupposes a readiness to question and to be questioned. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which I represent in my background and training, and of which this church is a member, expresses an aspect of this understanding on its website when it says, ELCA teaching or theology serves the proclamation and ministry of its faith. It does not have an answer for all questions, not even all religious questions. In a world where what it means to be human is an evolving concept, where beliefs and understanding and relationships and faith are continually challenged and continually reshaped, questions and inquiry are at the heart of what theology is. Such questioning is also at the heart of Mary Shelley's ghost story of human horror. In the 1818 edition of her book, Victor Frankenstein brings it forth like this. Whence, I often ask myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries. Now, Victor's question is scientific, of course, but it is also, for us as readers and hearers of that story, inseparably theological. Shelley herself alludes to such a view of the question when she writes in her introduction to the 1831 edition, "Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." That's creator with a capital C. So, what is it that Victor Frankenstein creates? How does he see himself as a small c creator in comparison to the capital C creator God? Victor describes it himself this way: "I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of simpler organization. But my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." In giving voice to those words through Victor Frankenstein, Shelley prepares us for inevitable theological comparisons and consequential theological questions. Does Victor assume the role of God? Can any human take on such a role? Should any human assume such power? Do debt and gratitude comprise a faithful motivation for such action? Do they form an ethical motivation? While these are all great questions to explore, I look today to yet another question that arises from Victor's objective. What does it mean to create a human being, to animate and give life to a being like ourselves? The findings of modern philosophy, anthropology, and psychology, well, they can offer help in exploring the theological avenues of these questions. They emphasize that human existence is communal, not individualistic. We become and stay human in the tension between personal identity and communal participation. We exercise our freedom not in isolation, but in continuous interaction with others. Human life, human beingness depends upon ecological structures of interrelationship. To put it another way, as humans, we live in dialogue. Indeed, long before we are conscious of the fact, we exist in response to an interaction with others. Before we can take the steps in our own individual growth and development, we first have to learn to trust others. The wisdom of that is beautifully captured in an African proverb. I am human only because you are human. I am human only because you are human. Within the light of this proverb, The theological horror of Mary Shelley's story is perhaps most clearly revealed. While Victor succeeds in his ambition to animate and create life, he fails miserably and fatally in relating to his creation. He does not recognize or acknowledge the humanness of the human being he has given life to. And in the process, Victor strips himself of his own humanity. Frankenstein's denial of his creation's humanity, well, it finds a fulcrum in the very moment of his creature's call to life. It goes like this in the book. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out. When, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limits were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful. But Victor goes on like this. Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I'd worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room. Victor's horror at his creation, his rejection of his creature, is a fear which can underlie so many relationships in our own lives. We give them other names, of course: abandonment, isolation, friendlessness, loneliness. Underneath it all, this root fear doesn't arise suddenly, neither for the faith stories recorded in the Bible, nor for Mary Shelley's tale. In the Bible, the fear of rejection begins right there at the beginning in Genesis. It is the fear that precedes God's opening question and dialogue with Adam. It is the fear that causes Adam to hide, to isolate himself. Within the nested layers of the Frankenstein story, that fear first expresses itself in the letters of Robert Walton. He says this: "But I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy, in the absence of the object of which I now feel as a most severe evil. I have no friend. I have no friend." Well ahead of the appearance of Victor Frankenstein and his creature, this is the first horror of Shelley's book. I have no friend. Shelley builds increasingly on this isolation and loneliness. Victor Frankenstein pathologically isolates himself. The creature is rejected not only by his creator, but by all who encounter him, on account of his appearance, his otherness. The creature even learns to reject himself. When I looked around, the creature says to himself, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster? A blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Fear that isolates, fear that rejects the other, the different, and even the self. Fear that swallows light and hope, fear of being cast to outer darkness. It's not foreign to theological inquiry. Not at all. It is not even distant in the past. Sadly, there are many faces of the church today that still abide with such fear-raised walls, dedicated to upholding very traditional and uncompromising views of culture, tribe, and family. There are voices of the church that describe those outside the prescribed models as problems to be guarded against. They see a surface, a skin of otherness. And like Victor Frankenstein, they name it as ugliness and describe it as an abomination without even attempting the relationship. Such voices within the church even talk of some human beings as being intrinsically disordered because of their seeming inability to live up to the uncompromising standards that the church arbitrarily upholds. It creates a fortress church of the holy in which those who fall short often feel excluded, even demonized by the language and rhetoric. Fortunately, those voices are not the only voices of the church or of theology. Pope Francis, for example, appears to offer a voice that responds to the theological inquiry in a different way. Describing the progress of the recent Synod on Family Life at its midpoint, Francis observes it this way. Evening falls on our assembly. It is the hour at which one willingly returns home to meet at the same table in the depth of affection, of the good that has been done and received, of the encounters which warm the heart and make it grow, good wine which hastens the unending feast in the days of man. It is also the weightiest hour, Francis says, for one who finds himself face to face with his own loneliness. In the bitter twilight of shattered dreams and broken plans, how many people trudge through the day in the blind alley of resignation, of abandonment, even resentment? In how many homes the wine of joy has been less plentiful, and therefore also the zest, the very wisdom for life. Francis's words, well, they almost seem to be a direct response to the creature's eloquent self-revelation as he hides in a hovel outside the countryside home of Felix and Agatha and their blind father, as he hides there in loneliness and despair. Despite his advanced agility, his ability to subsist on a coarser diet, his endurance of extreme heat and extreme cold, and his enhanced stature, the fragility of human existence is described perhaps no more keenly than by the creature in his lonely existence. He says it this way: "But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. Or if they had, all my past life was now a blot. A blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. I had never yet seen a being resembling me or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I?" The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. The truth of such human fragility, embodied and brought to life in these words, is something we can all recognize. It is a truth not to be condemned, but to be healed. The theological questions of life and faith and truth, proceeding from the intersecting words of Frankenstein's creature and Pope Francis, are these: how can we accompany humanity's most fragile sons and daughters, marked by wounded and lost love, with attention and care? It's a theological question. Another is this: how can we restore trust and hope to them, like the light of a beacon in a port or a torch carried among the people, not in fear, but to light the way for those who are lost or who find themselves in the midst of a storm? None of this is to say or imply that such theological inquiry is new or modern to our era, or even to the past 200 years, either in its form or its content. It's actually quite ancient. The Psalms, Psalm 139 in particular, give voice to an unformed creature, a golem in ancient Hebrew, as it said, a creature formed of earth, formed from imperfection, formed in fear, and yet drawn from darkness into relationship. As Mary Shelley may have heard it in the King James Version of her day, the voice of the psalmist puts it like this: "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them." The theological reflection and consideration of a human creature made of earth and animated with life. Well, it's not been confined to Hebrew scripture, to the story of Adam, or to the story of the golem in Psalm 139. It too has found enduring life in the centuries that have followed in Jewish folklore. According to the tradition of such folklore, a golem is inscribed with Hebrew words, such as the word emet, means truth in Hebrew, written across its forehead. The golem, with that word across his forehead, could then be deactivated, so to speak, by removing the first letter of the word. If you take off that beginning letter in the word emet, you end up with the word met, which means death in Hebrew. Truth to death, death to truth. A rabbi arriving in Barcelona from Germany in 1325 is reported to have remarked that the law of destruction is the reversal of the law of creation. 300 years later, in 1625, another rabbi, this time in Italy, writes, "Many legends of this sort are current, particularly in Germany." Nearly 200 years after that, in 1816, Mary Shelley and her colleagues listen to German ghost stories while in the Geneva area, and the story of Frankenstein is given life. Coincidentally, at least I think coincidentally, today's Geneva is home to the Lutheran World Federation. And if no longer a base for ghost and horror stories, it remains a center for theological conversations about humanity and what it means to be human. Indeed, in a document on faith and human rights, the Lutheran World Federation, in the midst of theological inquiry, observes this. In a certain sense, Jesus calls on humanity to realize that the other, is also created in God's image, and to act accordingly. In light of a more secular or modern interpretation, the image of God comprehends the concept of a human being's inalienable dignity. To recognize this dignity is to respect the other person and to acknowledge his or her rights. Jesus' teachings have elements of universality as they challenge those who do not recognize the other as an equal. Conversely, those who are excluded from the universal community are those who fail to recognize themselves as being created in God's image, and likewise not part of the larger community. Therefore, those excluded have excluded themselves. Jesus' treatment of the vulnerable and needy directs us toward those at the margins. Similarly, human rights direct us toward ensuring that those at the fringes of our society, those less able to determine their own well-being, become less vulnerable. These striking parallels make it apparent that promoting human rights is to work, albeit with different instruments, on the same project as that to which Jesus' practices bear witness. Through his practice, Jesus recognizes the other as being important and valuable in the eyes of God. Theologically, I have to ask, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein one of those different instruments of human rights? Does her tale direct us toward an awareness of those at the margins, those on the fringe? Does the story that she relates lead us toward awareness of the other, the rejected, the lonely? Does it open a conversation about relationships? Does it say something about the consequences of disconnecting faith and human rights? Dr. Antje Jacqueline, one of my professors at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, who at the time also directed the Zygon Center for Religion and Science, and who now presides as the Archbishop of Sweden. Well, she recently seemed to offer a theological yes to those theological questions. She writes this: "We are challenged by the spiritual poverty that otherwise well-to-do societies are facing. Secularization leaves us with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it is a result of the success of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because when the world is challenging us to be braver in affirming human freedom and dignity, it is challenging us with the fruits of our own preaching, which is good. On the other hand, secularization has undermined the knowledge and practice of faith, leaving especially young people without access to the spiritual resources offered by the church, or you can read that as a community of faith." She goes on, "Thus loneliness, the haunting feeling of never being fully accepted, and the lack of courage to fully face life's ups and downs are threats to the spiritual health of whole generations." Reading Frankenstein from a theological perspective, the reflection that Mary Shelley inspires in the course of her story, I see as no less profound and no less relevant. Loneliness and isolation, abandonment and rejection are illnesses that break apart families, break apart communities, break apart what is good and human in each of us. How do they do this? Well, the bits and pieces, they dissemble. And in the absence of relationship, into the void of aloneness, evil finds its way. In Walton's separation from his crew, in those opening and closing letters to the novel, the voice of mutiny grows strong. In Frankenstein, in Victor Frankenstein's pathological narcissism, he is lost. In the creature's rejection, he seeks the only relationship left to him to enforce: the relationship of being pursued as a murderer, of being hunted as prey. In the closing chapter of Frankenstein, as Walton, Frankenstein, and the creature converge on that frozen water of the Arctic, we sit on the verge of reconciliation, the edge of love, the precipice of resolution. Frankenstein, in those last moments, acknowledges his duty to his creation to assure his creature's happiness and well-being to the best of his ability. And Walton recognizes his responsibility to his crew and remarkably conquers fear and revulsion to engage the creature in dialogue. And the creature gives thanks for his creator and confesses his guilt. So close. So close. Even as it all falls apart. We see the domination of Frankenstein's conceit and vanity. We witness Walton refuse to give forgiveness, and we are shown that the creature's repentance is twisted by envy and vengeance. The novel ends with the apparent triumph of isolating loneliness as the creature sets out to end his existence. But soon, he cries, with sad and solemn enthusiasm, I shall die, and what I now feel will be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell. Dark words, dark thoughts. Self-accomplished expiation for a life that has failed. Self-accomplished expiation for a life that has failed. That's how a later German Lutheran theologian might have described it. Following Mary Shelley by 100 years or so, Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes this of suicide, of such self-accomplished expiation. This deed will usually take place in a state of despair, yet it is not the despair itself that is the actual originator of suicide, but rather a man's freedom to perform his supreme act of self-justification, even in the midst of this despair. If a man cannot justify himself in his happiness and his success, he can still justify himself in his despair. If he cannot make good his right to a human life in the life of his body, he can still do so by destroying his body. If he cannot compel the world to acknowledge his right, yet he can still assert this right himself in his last solitude. Suicide is a man's attempt to give a final human meaning to a life which has become humanly meaningless. The involuntary sense of horror which seizes us when we are faced with the fact of a suicide is not to be attributed to the iniquity of such a deed, but to the terrible loneliness and freedom in which this deed is performed, a deed in which the positive attitude to life is reflected only in the destruction of life. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was German, as I said. He takes a lot of words to say things, as most German language construct tends to do. You could say it another way. In his self-destruction, the creature's humanity is fulfilled. As Walton sees it, the creature is soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. Lost in darkness and distance. This is how the novel ends. But it's not an ending, is it? The story lives on, perhaps as vital today as when it was written. Indeed, those concluding words call to mind a similarly horrific conclusion to the Gospel according to Mark. Mark, after telling the story of Jesus, after relating the compassion and passion, the call to follow the healing, the feeding, the life, death, and empty tomb of Christ, well, Mark ends the Gospel with these words. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They said nothing to anyone. It was an ending that can't be. It's an ending so horrific that later scribes, well, they couldn't leave it alone. They had to add to it. And that's why you see a few more verses today on that. It's an ending, at least as Mark originally intended it. It's an ending meant to spark a question. And in sparking that question, to ignite action. Maybe they didn't say anything, but I will. I must. I see Mary Shelley's ending to her Frankenstein story as being like that. Lost. Lost in darkness and distance. That cannot be the end. Loneliness can't win. I don't think it does. The ash of her story now lives in you, in this gathered community. And in that, I see hope. I see relationship. I see faith. Brian Williams of the Anglican Church in Argentina, writing for a Lenten devotional this time of the year, puts it this way. Through faith, we experience God's love. Love is the world's most powerful energy, driving people to achieve great goals. It erases loneliness, sweeps away fear, liberates us, and gives us a sense of belonging. Love commits us to one another. It allows us to forgive and helps us to accept those who are different. In human relationship, people tend to ask, what can I get? Or, what do I need to give in return? Love calls us to turn our eyes toward others, to act out of compassion without asking for a cost benefit. You need faith to be inspired, hope to persevere, and love to accomplish the job. I'll leave you with a blessing as my conclusion. May Mary Shelley's ghost story be an instrument, a different instrument even, that brings that teaching, that theology to you. Thank you. The church here has graciously put together trays of cookies and drinks, and so you're welcome to engage one another there. It's about 4 o'clock. We have maybe 2 minutes for that, so I'll ask real quick. I won't do a Q&A, because that's not the point of theology. It's only the questions that matter. So maybe we can do Q and Q. Or we can talk out by the cookies too, which might be easier. All right.